Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, joined this morning by Sam Cedar of the excellent podcast The Majority Report and Ring of Fire Radio, writer and activist Michaela Angela Davis, formerly of Essence Magazine, Elise Jordan from the National Review, a former speechwriter for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and UP veteran John McWhorter, professor of linguistic and American studies at Columbia, also at the New Republic and TheRoot.com. Okay, so big story of the week. Maybe you have noticed. A few hours after we got off the air last week, Sunday actually, news broke that Herman Cain had been accused of sexually harassing two women while he was head of the trade association, the National Restaurant Association in the late 1990s. Cain emphatically denied the charges the very next day. Take a look.
I was the pollster for the National Restaurant Association when Herman Cain was the head of it. And I'll tell you, I was actually around a couple of times where this happened. And anyone who was involved with the Restaurant Association at the time knew that this was going to come up. I know the woman that is now being talked about. She wants to come forward now and talk. If she does go on the air and talk about it, I think it'll be the end of his campaign.
All right, so that was not Herman Cain, as you may have intuited, using your spider sense. That was a Republican pollster, essentially, who had worked with the National Restaurant Association, who gave that interview, basically saying, look, I was working there at the time. Now, this is a guy who's a Perry supporter and said, look, I was working there at the time, and I knew this was going to come out, and if it comes out entirely, this is going to be really bad for him. This precipitated Herman Cain's campaign, accusing the Perry campaign of being behind the links. So we know the facts that we have confirmed. There are two women who received settlements, and then there's a third woman who was reported this week by the AP who did not have a settlement, but also accused Cain. Cain's story about this has changed a bit over the course of the week. Here, let me now play you his first denial, the thing he first said when he was confronted about this.
I was accused of sexual harassment, falsely accused, I might add. I was falsely accused of sexual harassment, and when the charges were brought, as the leader of the organization, I recused myself and allowed my general counsel and my human resource officer to deal with the situation. And it was concluded after a thorough investigation that it had no basis. As far as a settlement, I am unaware of any sort of settlement. I hope it wasn't for much, because I didn't do anything. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not aware of a settlement that came out of that accusation. So as a result, I have never sexually harassed anyone, and those accusations are totally false.
The total for that settlement was $40 billion, so I'm not quite sure how I'm joking, of course. It was a year severance. It would be funny, though, to be like, I got no idea. I hope it wasn't a lot. It's like, actually, it bankrupted the National Restaurant Association. So the next day, Cain's top campaign advisor, Mark Block, who you know from this is this guy.
You can believe.
Mark Block, you are America. He got on stage at a press event in Washington, D.C., and he proclaimed Herman Cain's innocence.
Mr. Cain has never sexually harassed anybody, period, end of story.
Well, it's not the end of story, guys. So it kept going this week. Elise, what do you think of this development?
I think
is this a plot by us?
It was a godsend for Rick Perry.
You're like, I'm not saying.
That were quite strange.
Oh, what did he? Oh, yes.
Which hasn't gotten much coverage because Herman Cain has really stolen.
That is totally true.
From that, so it did happen at a very convenient time for Perry. Not sure who's involved in this. I'll be very interested who did. Get this story out there. But I think with the Herman Cain, my first instinct was, maybe it's going to be one of two things.
Yeah.
It's going to be an isolated incident where it really was a woman taking advantage, or it is going to be a serial repeat offense. And as of now, I don't know. We'll see how many more keep, being added to the lineup. But my opinion,
you're leaning towards the latter now.
Well, I just think that sexual harassment is usually. I have a pretty black and white view. It's not something that a man does just once. Usually, it's. You look at other politicians who have been troubled in this area, and usually it's not just one isolated, one-off instance. So
yeah, I should stipulate that this, situations like this put us in a slightly uncomfortable situation for those of us that work in cable news, right? Which is that we don't know the actual specific fact pattern. We know what has been confirmed and reported out, which is that there were 2 settlements.
Right.
So we don't, and accusation is not proof. No, I should just stipulate that up front. But it certainly does seem like there's more than nothing.
The man should know at this point that he can't deny something that happened, allowing that, let's suppose just maybe these things did happen. He can't deny it and have it not come out later. We've just been through Anthony Weiner, for example. All he had to do, remember that guy? Mr.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And so all that Cain had to do was say, yes, these things happened, I crossed a line, I wasn't aware, and all cultural mores were changing at the time. Probably he wasn't aware that what he was doing would be processed as offensive, I'm guessing. But he should realize that I did this and I'm beyond it. I apologize for it. And instead, there's this stunning stupidity of his, as usual, this lack of context, as if he was invented as some sort of robot yesterday and doesn't quite understand American social context, where he actually thinks that he can get away with it and deny it. And now
that's my favorite quote of characterization of Herman Cain ever.
I got to say that I think there is another explanation that. They had 10 days' notice that this story was coming out.
Right, Politico, yeah.
And if you look at the pattern of the way they've been running this campaign, if you accept the premise that it's actually a real campaign for presidency, and for the moment, let's do
at the
that.
top of the polls.
Right. Yeah, I think that's...
Let's all play along. Continue.
Exactly. But
charts
look at the attitude. Look at the attitude in the Smoking Man video. I think they said, this is going to be a good way for us to run against the press. Mm-hmm. Nobody in the conservative movement has gone broke, let's say, not having enemies in the press. And I think for them, to a certain extent, there was we can actually get mileage off of looking like we're blindsided by it.
Michaela, what do you think?
It's interesting when Elise said that this was good news for Perry, and it is. It's like the GOP is doing better than Bravo in producing these reality stars. And that's really what, he's the new Nene, Herman Cain.
Oh my God, that reference totally went over my head. Nene is
from the Real Housewives of Atlanta.
Oh, okay. Okay, no, it's all right. We're good. Okay. We're good. I'm just getting resetting.
This is about, right?
Okay.
Meaning that it's like whose drama is at the top of the charts. That's why I was saying it's more than they're creating these reality stars, and so this is what watching Herman Cain's candidacy is like to me. It's like the real GOP, it's
the real GOP.
It is,
crazy.
And it's interesting to me that what we've seen is the first polls that have emerged in the wake of the scandal have him essentially unhurt. He's still at the top of the polls, and his campaign, he's up.
He's up.
And he's raised $1 million. His campaign keeps putting out press releases about how much money they have raised off this.
He's a brother from another mother of the Koch brothers. Did you see that?
Yes, this is what he said yesterday.
Kind of minstrel show in reverse. I'm a brother from another mother.
This is a minstrel show in reverse.
I've never seen anything quite like it.
I want to talk about the sort of racial angle of this, and we have the fantastic scholar Kimberly Crenshaw on satellite. Let's take a break and come back, and she'll join us, and we'll talk more about this.
Do you think that race, being a strong black conservative, has anything to do with the fact that you've been so charged? And if so, do you have any evidence to support that?
I believe the answer is yes, but we do not have any evidence to support it. Relative to the left, I believe that race is a bigger driving factor. I don't think it's a driving factor on the right. This is just based upon our speculation.
Mm-hmm. I kind of like the honesty of that answer, saying, yes, I do think race is a factor, but I don't have any evidence.
Empirical evidence.
Joining us now to talk more about this situation is Kimberly Crenshaw, law professor at Columbia University and UCLA. She's co-founder of the African American Policy Forum. Professor Crenshaw, it's great to have you. Good morning.
Good morning.
So what do you think, when you just were part of a... you were just part of a conference on Anita Hill 20 years later, and... that was the last time that this crazy intersectionality, to use a word that I believe you coined in scholarship, appeared, of the sort of intersection of the sort of issue of sex and gender and power with race in this incredibly intense way. What are you making of this story as it unfolds this week?
Well, I'm absolutely astonished about how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. Let's go with what stayed the same. The ability to make a racial argument out of an allegation that ostensibly, until we know better, does not yet raise any racial claims is just amazing, especially coming from someone like Herman Cain and his defenders, who traditionally have rejected racial arguments, who would otherwise call this playing the racial card. Here you have him saying, I think race has something to do with it. I can't tell you how it has anything to do with it. We don't have any evidence, but trust us, race has something to do with it. The fact that he's able to do this actually goes all the way back to Clarence Thomas stepping into the hearings. You know, we were all there. We had no idea what he was going to say, how he was going to respond to this. But the last thing most of us thought he was going to do was to wrap himself up in a history of racial discrimination, of lynching no less, when he'd been a person who'd repudiated all of this discourse about discrimination. But, you know, nothing sort of breeds a civil rights activist until desperation hits. And so that's essentially what we saw work 20 years ago, and it's just astonishing that it's working again today.
Kimberly, you drew a parallel. You mentioned Clarence Thomas and the famous line that he gave at the Anita Hill, at his own confirmation testimony in the wake of Anita Hill's testimony, that he said it was a high-tech lynching. And there was, throughout the week, the obvious subtext of the comparison between the Anita Hill situation and this for several reasons. It was a claim of sexual harassment against a prominent black conservative. That subtext was made the text this week by the Cain campaign, which cut this ad, which I want to play for everyone, which sort of blew my mind.
They can't argue with Herman Cain on the merits. They can't argue with Herman Cain on policy. So what do they do?
Now we're getting the high-tech lynching of a beautiful man, Herman Cain.
What is known as the mainstream media goes for the ugliest racial stereotypes they can to attack a black conservative.
They put them down. And that's what liberals do, Imus. They can't talk about the issues, so they hit below the belt.
I think he needs to get off the symbolic crack pipe.
So I would only assume that he is either socially ignorant or playing games to get votes.
It's very hard to comment on somebody who is so denied intelligence.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. It is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, you will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured, rather than hung from a tree.
Wow. That sound, Kimberly, is really incredible to see again, just in how sort of breathtakingly forward it is in making that explicit comparison.
Absolutely. And, you know, it tells us that there are two different trajectories that came out of the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearing. One is the direction that gender discourse has gone, and that's been pretty positive. We understand that sexual harassment is a serious workplace matter, that it is discrimination, and consequently most organizations like the National Restaurant Association will now have rules and training against it. The direction of race discourse has gone somewhat differently. So when Clarence Thomas was able to denounce this entire hearing essentially as a racist effort to rein in free-thinking African Americans, and after all the jaws were dropped, it ended up working. Yeah. It opened up a whole new terrain for African American conservatives to defend themselves against almost any criticism. So, you know, for the group that constantly vehemently denounces playing the race card, this is a race card that is firmly in their hand, and they play it every chance they get. The fact that they even can play it when they also seem to be pointing inside the party to the Perry campaign, that these are not mutually exclusive.
Those are mutually exclusive theories of the crime.
Yes.
Let me just say one more thing, and then I want our panel is eager to talk to you. But aren't liberals also on the horns of that dilemma in the sense that if as a liberal you're committed to the notion to not dismiss claims of racial animus as outright as playing the race card, to take them seriously, to understand that racial animus and bias can work its way through our crazy politics in all kinds of ways. Don't liberals then have a responsibility not to be dismissive of Herman Cain when he comes forward with a claim like that?
Of course we want to take racism seriously, but just think about it. How many times has anyone ever been able to go on TV and say, I think race has something to do with it. I can't tell you who, I can't tell you how, I can't tell you where, but race has something to do with it. That's essentially playing the race card, the exact kind of thing that liberals and African Americans have been accused of. So what we're concerned about is the double standard, and I think the double standard points in the direction of conservatives being able to wrap any number of misdeeds around the claim of playing the race card.
And it's the Joker card of the race card, because this whole, black when convenient is really disturbing, and because they're black without the burden. It's when it works for them in that narrative. But what have they been doing historically to elevate the lives of black people? It's so Kimberly, do you find that really disturbing? This okay, I'm black now because I'm against the wall.
And it's selective, as you point out. But I think what's even more dramatic about it is it turns history on its head. Yeah. I mean, the idea that Herman Cain or Clarence Thomas shares the legacy of thousands of people who were found hanging from trees because they challenged a system of racial dominance, not because they were supporters of it. The idea that, those people who are basically saying, let's accommodate, let's not talk about race discrimination, that they would be lynched, just turns tragedy on its head.
I find this quite frankly upsetting. Because why are we still talking about this and defining Herman Cain in terms of race? And it's happened all throughout this. He is an accomplished man. He has many merits that he should be judged upon besides race.
But did he not say that?
Why? By this point, why is he, even before this happened, he's, the Clarence Tom, now that's being used. But people talking about, he's an Uncle Tom, minstrel show, this and that. I think it's really offensive. Why can he not just be a conservative man, an American?
But I'll tell you what I find particularly offensive about it. What I found offensive was the idea that we're talking about our blacks and their blacks, the Ann Coulter statement. If it wasn't
which was too
offered as
preposterous
serious
for me to even
politics,
mention,
it would be a Dave Chappelle kind of comedy. We'll put your blacks and our blacks together and run a race or something. Yeah. I mean, that's what conservative politics have reduced race discourse to. And I think that it's important for us to be able to reclaim the idea that there are some moments where race discrimination is important and we need to talk about it, and there are other moments where people are just pointing to race to defend a claim that has nothing to do with race.
Right. John McWhorter has something that he wants to respond to, and I'm going to let him do that right after this break. Kimberly, if you stick around, that would be great. We're going to come back and talk more about this. Quickly had to tweet, I am America, one voice united we stand, just because as a way of getting it out of my head. We have it's like cathartic, because once it gets in there, I need to share it with everyone else.
Or it might just slip out in
the middle. I might do the karaoke I've been threatening now for 2 weeks. Kimberly Crenshaw, law professor at UCLA and Columbia, is on satellite with us. But I cut off John McWhorter, who wanted to respond right before we went to break. John.
Elise, here's why Herman Cain is about race, and it's because before all of this happened this week, he was being a very stridently black person in his presentation. And the fashion is to say that he was being a minstrel, because he was using sense of humor. He'd drop in some black English. He would pretend not to be very bright. Ooh, Becky, 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 Stan. All of that was a black man rooted in black culture trying to be funny. And we're told that he was being...
Occasionally succeeded, I will say.
Occasionally, he can be funny. And we're told it's minstrel, but the problem is anybody who says that needs to be asked. He's a black man rooted in black culture. How can he be funny that isn't minstrel? We're told that anything Tyler Perry does is minstrel. We're told that when rappers try to be funny, it's minstrel. It's too confining. What he was doing was being funny as this Georgian 65-year-old black man that he was. So he was doing a black thing. In a way, he's blacker in that way than Obama. He wasn't trying to play it down. And so he was being a very black person. Now, this business about it being a black thing that he gets accused of sexual harassment is perfectly absurd. But he was not keeping it quiet that he wasn't white.
But John,
and I liked it at first.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here because the cultural figure of the black conservative is a fascinating and contested one, particularly I think in the modern incarnation of it, in which racial politics are so polarized.
Judas villain.
Yes, Judas villain, and but also hero on the right, often because it's a hero on the right for a bunch of reasons. I think one, because it expiates the collective sin of racism, because look, Herman Cain is leading our field, and I don't think that's some of that. I think is a good-natured intent to transcend race and the racial hazards of the past. But you were cast as the role of the black conservative for much of your sort of public life and career, and less so now. What is the sort of, I don't know, what is the psychological experience of that like, if that's not a strange question to ask?
No, it's not strange at all. It's assumed that if you don't subscribe to a certain orthodoxy, then you are either naive, there are just some basic facts about the nature of poverty and the nature of institutional racism that you don't know, or you're evil. And I think that there's a natural human tendency to suppose that evil is more likely. And so there's this actual notion. And it took me a few years to understand that people actually thought this was who I was. You know, my friends and my family know me. People thought that I understood the orthodoxy, but I was going out in public and saying there's no racism and talking down black people in order to make money. I gradually learned that people thought that I was trying to get speaking fees saying that. And smart people genuinely believe that that must be who you are, and you're called Judas, you're a bad apple, as Harry Belafonte called Herman Cain, because they can't imagine that there's another way of looking at things besides the notion that when black people have problems, it is always or almost always due to institutional racism. I can put myself in those people's heads, but that's why the black conservative is so vilified, because it's assumed that you could not possibly have views significantly to the right of, say, Cornel West and be a moral or intelligent person.
Kimberly, I want you to respond. Yeah.
So there's so many reasons why there's such trenchant debate about black conservatives, and I don't doubt John's experience, but I have to add that one of the reasons why has to do with the specious use of playing the race card. The Clarence Thomas event that we talked about just shows the selectivity of black neoconservatives. Sometimes they're making claims about color blindness at the same time performing racial texts and performing racial defenses. So one of the things that just, I think, is one part of the way they're received is it feels like hypocrisy. But more importantly, I think the problem is that it deflects us from what's really going on. So in the same way that Clarence Thomas's playing the race card deflected the conversation away from sexual harassment, away from the fact that actually African American women were the first ones to make a legal claim against sexual harassment, turning it into a race versus gender claim rather than a race and gender claim. This is part of what's going on, and this is why race can sometimes be more obscuring than helpful. Race, of course, is there, but rarely in the way that the neoconservatives claim it is.
Sam Cedar.
Along those points, I think what's going to be interesting is to see if we do ultimately find out if these women do come forward or are released from there.
I think, unfortunately for them, it's inevitable that their names will come out.
The real question
is, and it will be a game changer.
This is the interesting interesting question.
Of
yes.
What
race is? Yes.
Is going to be very interesting to see
It will be a game changer.
How that what kind of reaction that brings from those people who are more inclined to support Kaine now. In Florida.
We'll have a whole 2-hour show on that.
Very difficult for him. As I said before, I'm not making an argument that race has nothing to do with how people will interpret this story. I think if this story comes out and it turns out that some of the complainants are in fact white, that will create a whole nother historical narrative that will be hard to step away from. More importantly, I think actually hearing what he's actually accused of doing. Right now, it's just conceptual, sexual harassment. But we know that after Anita Hill came forward, one of the reasons people believed her more and more as time passed is that they were able to hear from other people who had similar experiences in their own workplace. So when these women actually come forward and it's told what actually happened, I think that will shift the underlying discussion significantly.
Elise. I would like to throw a counterfactual. If President Obama had a single instance of mild shadiness, it would have been totally out there in the press, and I think he would have been attacked pretty tough.
Yep.
So Herman Cain, at the same time, I think we should look at it somewhat through that lens.
Right.
And I think President Obama is absolutely 100% clean. I think if there was anything out there, they would have found it, and they would have gone after it. So why would the same not be true somewhat?
And I see what you're saying. If they found it, everybody would have said it was racist.
Right, exactly. Take that one step forward. What you're saying is that people would defend him using these racial terms if he were accused.
Well, I think that's a fair point. I want to say something to what John had said. John, you are sane. You are a sane black conservative, and I think what we're seeing. No, but what we're seeing is
the comedy. You can feel it here.
It's a type of insanity. But what's encouraging about these kind of conversations is that there's not enough diversity inside of diversity, meaning that there are more black people now on television with the mic talking, and Clarence Thomas at the time was the first time we actually humanized a black conservative, and Anita Hill was so smart too. So what you're seeing is more black people, and seeing that we're not monolithic.
Right, and I think actually one of the
black way
and I think there's as much insanity on the black left as the black right. And
there's
talk about
insanity
distraction.
in humanity.
Exactly.
And that's the thing, is that we are starting to humanize people of color,
and I think
that we're not humanized.
I think one of the greatest things, I think one of the most fascinating and one of the great legacies of the presidency of Barack Obama in a cultural respect, and I find this in the show. We find this in the show. We say this in the editorial meeting. The show comes back when you're talking about the through line of politics. Race is it's Du Bois called it the problem of the 20th century, and here we are in the 21st century, and
Ken Burns said that's the story.
Right, and in some ways it's been the story of America, and we end up on this show. I find that we come back to time and again, but I think that the presidency of Barack Obama has produced a situation in which some of the dialogue obviously is awful and calls upon all sorts of terrible stereotypes, etc. But a lot of it gives us an opportunity to have conversations much more frankly, much less at the margin of taboo than we had before. And I think that's a great thing. Kimberly Crenshaw.
So I have to disagree.
Okay. I'm going to let you disagree, and then I have to go to break. So,
well, all I'll say is that it's a complicated legacy because many people see Barack Obama as representing post-racialism. Mm-hmm. So almost any conversation has to slide in by saying, well, I know we have a black president, but having a black president really doesn't tell us much about the character of race in American society.
Oh, it tells us plenty. Nobody claims we're post-racial. We're just less racialized than we used to be, and that's significant.
I would say that we're equally racialized. You can have different racial orders.
Well, how about this? I'm going to give you guys each 5 seconds to litigate whether we're post-racial. I'm kidding. Kimberly Crenshaw, law professor at Columbia University and UCLA, co-founder of African American Policy Forum. We will have you back to talk more about this in the future. Thanks so much for your time this morning. We will be right back after this. All right, so we've been talking about Herman Cain because the Herman Cain topic is endlessly fascinating, in my humble opinion, as a host of a cable news show. And I want to now zoom out for a moment to discuss how we talk about politicians and sex scandals, in quotes, because I think we have a set of contradictory and conflicting moral impulses, and that get mixed in with some puritanical revulsion and some prurient interest, right? Like we want to see the photo, everyone wants to see what the Anthony Weiner photo was. The result is that we get it's unclear what the benchmark is and what the framework by which we evaluate the sins of politicians is. It seems very, very tangled to me. You start getting comparisons, Anthony Weiner and Bill Clinton, who did very different things, and I think in terms of the actual violation was really different. Having sex with an intern in your office versus sending a photo to someone. And then we end up talking. And then the other thing we do, and we're doing it in the case of Kane, is because we have this tangled set of intuitions that no one has a sort of communal setting of like what the terms are for what's bad and what's good and how we rank them. We talk about the handling of them, the meta sin of denying it or dissembling or not being straight with the story. And then you get these, I think, strange outcomes. So my favorite example of this is that in 2003, the Los Angeles Times published this blockbuster story revealing that Arnold Schwarzenegger had a known history and pattern of groping women against their will. So this is a very serious charge.
You said groping.
Groping. Like gropers can and often are charged with sexual assaults. Like like touching someone sexually against their will is sexual assault. Schwarzenegger did not lie about it or sort of deny it. He came forward and he said this.
But at the same time, I have to tell you that I always say that wherever there's smoke, there's fire. That is true. And so what I want to say to you is that yes, that I have behaved badly sometimes. Yes, it is true that I was on rowdy movie sets and I have done things that were not right, which I thought then was playful, but now I recognize that I have offended people.
Rowdy movie sets. Exactly. But I mean, so the thing that was so amazing, you mentioned Schwarzenegger at the top of this hour when we were talking about this. Schwarzenegger was able to be like, my bad, y'all. And then it was no longer an issue.
I think he was able to get away with that for two reasons. Hollywood, people expected.
People think like rowdy movie sets. They're all just groping each other. Cartoon characters. It's like Caligula.
He came out with it and he controlled the storyline. And unlike Herman Cain, who's had his story confused over this entire week, and Anthony Weiner, that was if he had come out early and he was like, I've got this weird thing, I haven't cheated, and part of the Anthony Weiner,
you were definitely right about that on Weiner.
It was so freaky, and it was our first internet sex scandal, and so it just imploded completely.
Well, we do have the Mark Foley IMs, didn't
Mark Foley? The IM.
Bishop Eddie Long.
I think he gets a pass because it's Hollywood. I mean, I do think like that we contextualize that differently, and he had to
savvily use
the foreign accent helped too.
Right, but I think he had to dispose of the character that we perceive him of in the movies. I think he had to sort of dispose of that whole. There was no continuum.
Right.
I was an action star, now I'm a governor.
That wouldn't work as well.
It doesn't follow in the same way that I was a lobbyist and now I'm a politician. You expect a different.
I have a question to the men because as a woman and as someone that identifies as a feminist, this is a male narrative, and because women are not in the positions of power in the way that men are to even have these scandals. So what do you see the connection between power and sex and your feeling entitled to grope because you have power?
I do think there's.
I'm not familiar with that.
I would say this. I would say I was always sort of amazed in Washington how patriarchal Washington is. Elise, you worked in Washington. I think you know what I'm talking about. Maybe you disagree with me, but it's when you go on the Hill, it's a lot of powerful men in suits.
Yes, and
it's a lot of. Young, pretty women, and that is a dynamic.
Because powerful men in suits hire young, pretty women.
And there is this very intense, I think, loaded sort of patriarchal power air that hangs over official Washington. That's I find very gender aggressive, very strange, and I think makes it very hard for women who are operating in a place like the National Restaurant Association or the Hill. And I'm not even saying this as whether Kane did or not. I'm talking about the basic facts of, or as Ron Susskind said, in the Obama White House. I mean, I think that, and that's not necessarily
really
the male club.
Which is really disturbing.
But did you find?
I thought the Bush White House was incredibly female friendly, and you can look at the women who are in leadership roles in the Bush White House, and I think that Karen Hughes, Condi Rice. I mean, I can think of a lot of prominent women in the Bush.
But that doesn't necessarily always mean that always doesn't transfer down, right? I mean, did you feel like official Washington writ large had this very
separate of? I think it's such an old boys culture.
That's why Shirley Chisholm during her campaign was so. When she did that mantra, she just said it over and over again, like white men. Someone has to start to change the conversation. Right. And though we knew she wasn't electable, and she knew, and I was always disappointed that neither Hillary or President Obama acknowledged Shirley Chisholm in their journey because she's fierce. And the fact that she just at that time was saying someone else has to be in this conversation. It can't just be
Shirley Chisholm,
white men.
Who ran for president, the first
black woman.
There was a time not so long ago when one made jokes about a certain man being all hands. And that was just all there was. That's what sexual harassment is. And I've always thought it was a civil rights miracle that over the past 20 years we've learned to call that something and to consider it socially prescribed, which is why it's so backwards that the Kaine people and his supporters are acting as if it's no big deal or that it couldn't possibly be. They seem like people from a 1950s movie.
Right, and we've all watched Mad Men, and what happens when you watch Mad Men is you think, wow, the country used to exist under conditions of essentially gender apartheid. Right. I mean, those were the conditions of the country, and that was accepted as a social norm.
Imagine being a black woman.
Right.
And every time you dip it in race, it's even more.
Betty Draper was suffering
it's still such a disturbing phenomenon with the way we're discussing this specific sexual harassment claim. These women, I think they wanted to move on with their lives. The women in question.
No, I know.
And the fact that they're being called to come out of, they're being asked not to be anonymous.
One of them. I will say this. My understanding of the reporting is that the lawyer for one of them has said his client would like to be released, would actually like to come forward. So I think one of them actually wants to come forward.
Lawrence O'Donnell offered to pay, and so if he's going to take on that very, very hefty legal bill, I think that she should go at it.
What do we know now that we didn't know when the week began? My answer right after this. Just a second, I'll tell you what I didn't know when the week began, but right now it's time for a preview of Weekends with Alex Witt. Alex, what's coming up this morning?
All right, let me get right to it then, Chris. A legendary voice silenced this morning. Andy Rooney, for years the common sense curmudgeon on 60 Minutes, has died. A look at some of his most memorable moments ahead. Also, new word on 2012 strategy for President Obama this weekend, because it's almost 1 year out from the election. We're going to examine one unique assessment of what it's going to take for the president to win. Also, the iPhone 4S, one of the most hyped aspects of the new device, going down. It left a lot of folks frustrated. So what happened there? We're going to take a look. Chris, back to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. So what do we know now that we didn't know last week? Well, we know that 80,000 jobs were created in the month of October, and the unemployment rate dipped from 9.1% to 9%. We know that not only are members of Congress insulated from the abysmal economy, but they are much richer than average Americans, and we suspect this plays a crucial role in producing a legislative body, more specifically a Republican Party, that continues to ignore the jobs crisis. We know that at least 3 women have made allegations that Herman Cain sexually harassed them during his time running the National Restaurant Association. We know that allegations are not proof, but we also know 20 years after Anita Hill's testimony, life for these women is going to be hell once their names are inevitably leaked. We know Cain is in trouble because there is nothing the press loves more than a scandal that involves a politician and sexual impropriety. But we also know that our collective intuitions on sexual impropriety are tangled and contradictory, but that consent and non-exploitation of unequal power relationships is the bedrock ethical principle we should keep our attention on as the details continue to come out. We know that Greece won't be putting its proposed package of further austerity policies to a referendum, but we do know there is a whole lot about the situation we do not know. Like, for instance, the total risk that U.S. banks face in the event of a Greek default. We know that's pretty damn terrifying. Thanks to a leaked internal Romney campaign memo, we now know that the Koch brothers are the, quote, financial engine of the Tea Party. We also know that Herman Cain considers the Kochs his own, quote, brothers from another mother. We know this is simply a figure of speech, although given how crazy the Cain campaign has been so far, who knows? We know that the Building Trades Union wins the award for most bald-faced co-option of the Occupy Wall Street message by marshaling the language of the 99% in support of the Keystone Pipeline, which is being heavily pushed by the oil and gas industries, including aforementioned Koch brothers, and being opposed by everyone from environmentalists to Nebraska's Republican governor. We also know it's a testament to the force of the 99% message that everyone these days seems to want a piece of it. We already knew that Elizabeth Warren was a badass, but after watching her graciously and firmly talk down a Tea Party heckler at a volunteer meeting, we know she is also a very cool customer.
Very sorry to hear that you've been out of work. I'm also very sorry that the recent jobs bill that would have brought 22,000 jobs to Massachusetts did not pass in its.
And regarding said heckler, we now know that if you're going to show up to an event and call someone a socialist whore, you should probably have a better exit strategy than this dude, who darted for the back door only to find it was locked. Thanks to a new report from the Department of Energy's Inspector General, we know that the much maligned folks at the DOE did a remarkable job in dispersing $35.2 billion in stimulus funds, with only 0.07% of that money recovered from fraud. We know that Lady Gaga has, along with the MacArthur Foundation, launched a new foundation to work on anti-bullying and tolerance among teens. We also know that being as free as one's hair is something all teenagers can aspire to. We'll be right back. I want to find out what my guests know now they didn't know when the week began. Sam Seder of the Majority Report, what do you now know?
Well, based upon what happened in Nevada, I know that if you pass a law that starts in October and tell banks you need to sign an affidavit that you actually own this mortgage and can go in and begin foreclosure procedures, they will back off. They went in September, they had 3,600 foreclosure starts in Nevada. In October, 116.
Wow.
It dropped 95% once that law.
Because they passed a law saying you actually have to have the documentation.
You actually have to prove that you own this mortgage, and they know that they can't prove it.
That's a crazy concept. Michaela Angela Davis, what do you now know?
You know what I know now is that Chris Hayes is from the Boogie Down Bronx.
That's so true. That is true.
That he knows the difference between a pound and a fist bump. That's big. But also I learned that we have gone down to 26 in the industrialized world in terms of education, and that is so disturbing. I knew we were at 25, and then we
dropped another notch.
We dropped another notch, and I think that you said something earlier, John, about that was one of your biggest concerns, where we are in terms of education. That is our entire future.
Elise Jordan, what do you now know?
I learned that the Obama administration isn't going to give us the Lockie memo about why we decided to kill an American citizen abroad in a targeted drone strike. Now, I would like to see that legal reasoning, and I think the American people deserve to see that legal rationale, too. So it'll be interesting to watch how I think this drone issue is huge.
Elise Jordan, I agree with you on that. I, too, would like to see that as a journalist about why we thought we could kill Anwar al-Awlaki in a drone strike. John McWhorter, what do you now know that you didn't know when the week began?
Well, I now know that fundraising spike notwithstanding, I think that Herman Cain is over. I thought that there was a chance that we might see something unprecedented in terms of his staying power and possibly even a really interesting Obama-Cain contest. But as of what we've seen last week, ooh, Becky, stan, that was just cute. But for Politico to give him a 10 days lead time and for him to really think that he could get beyond this shows that he will be a punchline or a footnote a year.
You can't quote Pokemon and be a real contender.
Yeah, Rachel had him quoting Pokemon last night. My thanks to Sam Seder of the Majority Report, writer and activist Michaela Angela Davis, Elise Jordan from the National Review, who's here for the first time, and thank you so much, and John McWhorter, professor at Columbia, also from the New Republic and TheRoot.com. And thank you for joining us today for Up. Coming up next is Weekends with Alex Witt, and join us tomorrow, Sunday morning at 8 a.m. for Aaron Brockovich, Senator Sherrod Brown on the Ohio collective bargaining vote, and one of the greatest moral philosophers of our time, Peter Singer, on the Mississippi debate over personhood. Until then, you can find us on Twitter at UpWithChris. See you tomorrow. Thanks for getting up.
Ooh, I'm gonna